I'll just say really quickly, I think one thing that, you know, certainly changes the playing field is that, you know, you have certainly for government and for everybody, I guess, really, I mean, everybody agrees, we've got to smooth an economic, we've got to make this economic recovery happen as quickly as possible and as equitably as possible. And childcare certainly has a role to, an essential role to play in that. And then the other thing I've been thinking a lot about lately, because I'm thinking about my kids going back to school in the fall. And, you know, I think we know that that's not going to look like normal. It's going to look different. And so what role childcare is going to play in that, I think, also remains an open question. So suddenly we have this kind of space where, like, all these systems and entities we relied on sort of as stalwarts and sort of essential pieces towards us functioning normally as workers and as families and in our children's learning and as families are not operating normally. And certainly I think a lot of people hold childcare there as some part of the answer. And so it certainly invites a different type of thinking and I think it was it Don or Chris who articulated earlier, I think it was the premier who would talk about all these different systems and then, like, oh, and childcare. You know, and we were watching that, I think, as governments, provincial governments were looking at their list of essential services, and so you could sort of see the way they were coming to understand childcare so much as this afterthought and sort of stumbling upon it. And we're really seeing that flip, and it really is inviting this type of thinking that moves you to more of a type of universal program. So there is that opportunity. And there's probably no person who knows this more than Andrew Bevan, so I won't steal his thunder. But if you're going to move into that space, it's really not a kind of make the statement, snap your fingers kind of space. You need a lot of runway to get there.
Yeah. I think I'd say that one of the things that we and many others of you realized quite early was that this was a really different kind of economic crisis, a different kind of recession. It was one in which, as Andrew has already alluded to and has been, I think, well documented, this is a recession that has hit women particularly hard, both in their paid and their unpaid work. And we've certainly seen, as jurisdictions have moved to reopening, that those sectors that have had the greatest facility in reopening have been those that have more traditionally male employment. So we see that women were the first out and the last back, in part as a result of where they are sectorally, but also in part as a result of the structural conditions of care. So in our sort of original diagnosis, and this is like in March, of trying to figure out where we need to go in terms of not just thinking about how do we deal with this moment, but how do we move towards reopening and rebuilding, we were really trying to socialize the concept of social infrastructure as one that is quite different from other tools that have been used historically. So in other recessions that have really begun in the financial sector, those have tended to hit male employment hardest, and the tools that governments have used to stimulate the economy have been largely around built infrastructure, your roads, your bridges, your construction projects, and those have stimulated male employment. And this is a very different kind of recession that calls for a different kind of remedy. And so we wanted to anchor an approach in social infrastructure that is both built and in investing in the kind of collective services that are building a social policy framework. And childcare, of course, is at the very center of that. It has the added advantage, of course, of both being a job builder in terms of building new centers, in terms of hiring often and disproportionately women who work in the sector, but also all of the multiplier effects that accrue as a result of women's increased labor market participation, increased revenues that go to taxes, increased spending in local communities, and all of those lovely multiplier effects that we know so well. I think that our thinking initially, and I think it's cemented over time, is that there is an immediate term, which is the reopening term, and there are some really big challenges. And Kate has alluded to those, especially around safety and parental confidence, even in sending kids to centers, in terms of the huge costs that centers themselves or home care providers have in terms of the number of kids that they can take into care, the kind of protective equipment they need, the kind of cleaning they need. So the overall costs have gone up. Those are immediate term issues, but there's also not losing sight of the long-term building that has to start now, that will protect us against the kind of vulnerabilities that we've experienced in this crisis, and also sort of reimagine a rebuilding of the economy that sustains all of those who've been affected by this particular crisis.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that you know, if the question, Joanne, was are there new arguments to be made at this particular moment in support of a national childcare system, I think the basic answer to that is no, because all of the arguments that everyone who's on today have been making for a long time are still germane. They still hold true. You know, whether you want to do right by kids or right by parents, or the gender equity argument, or why it's good for the economy, or why it's good for socialization. I mean, you know, that full range of argumentation all holds true. The difference is context has changed, as folks are saying, obviously, and the crystallization that Kate mentioned at the beginning of how care in general is really at the core of our society and of our economy. The economy obviously being a subset of society. That crystallization means that a whole bunch of things have been accentuated, and that accentuation allows more people than usual, including politicians, to understand why those arguments that have always been made are actually right and true. Mm-hmm. And that's the possibility we have right now, is to keep on making sure that it gets heard over and over and over again, because the crystallization has made it much more tangible for way more folks than usual as to why this is required. And that to me means, I totally understand why, for example, pedagogy is very, very important, and understand why other folks in government, for example, might talk about this through the economic lens. I'm all about broadening coalitions for something like this. And so, as Martha was saying, the broader range of reasons that are explained to people that have become more tangible as to why this is a necessary requirement to build a decent society, then let's use all those arguments. But none of them are new, in my view. They're just accentuated.